Okay, I'm going to go over now what is probably one of the tougher skills in the class. It's completing the square. And notice that it's really important that you've worked on both skills, completing the square intro and completing the square intermediate before you try to tackle this skill. Each of those have necessary techniques that you're going to need to be able to utilize when you're working on this skill. Okay, so here's just a quadratic function. And really what we're going to do is use completing the square to put this function into vertex form. Okay, so here's my solution for it. Maybe zoom a little. Okay, so we just have g of x is equal to 4x squared minus 28x plus 49. The first step, and this is what makes this different. This is what makes completing the square different than the skill completing the square intermediate, is now you're actually going to sometimes have an a that's not 1. The first thing is to get that over to the other side. So we're going to divide both sides by 4, and you'll see what happens. That we'll put a g of x over 4 here. It doesn't matter what g of x is. Just let it hang out and be g of x. I'm going to divide it by 4. Over here, 4 divided by 4 is equal to 1, so I just have x squared. And that's the whole point of this step, is for that to happen. And then we have negative 28 divided by 4, which is just negative 7. And then 49 divided by 4, which is 49 over 4. That's the other part that's tricky with this skill, is that you end up with more fractions in this one than you did with the previous two. So I have noticed that some people just hate fractions and will use decimals here, and that works as well. You know, you can input your answers in common with decimals. Probably as long as they're not repeating, but I don't think I've seen any instances of those. Okay, now the next step is then just to move C over to the other side. And this is the same as what you were doing in completing the square intermediate. All you had to do in that skill was just move C over before you completed the square. So same thing here. I'm going to subtract 49 over 4 from both sides. That gets rid of it here, so I will now have room to complete my square, and it puts it over here on the left side. Now, I'm going to have to add a number that completes the square over here on the right side. Now, this is the same as what you learned to do in completing the square intro. That's the first thing. It's just knowing what number is going to complete a square over here. And we're luckier if this is a number divisible by 2, but here it's not. It's an odd number. But the process is still the same. You'll just have to get a little fractional. So I'm just going to take negative 7. I'm going to divide it by 2, and then I'm going to square the result. And so that ends up being 49 over 4. Okay. So I'm going to add this number to both sides, because if I only add it to the right side, then I change the equation, right? I have to do something that I'm doing to both sides of the equation. And that gives me this right here, x squared plus minus 7x plus 49 over 4. And over here, this 49 over 4 is negative, and this is positive. Those cancel out and give you 0. Now that won't always happen. Sometimes you're going to have a fraction over here, like, I don't know, plus 1/8 or something like that. But in this, that happens to be a feature of this particular example, that those cancel out. Okay. Let me take you to the next page. Too much zoom. Okay, so now we're getting close. We've got the number that completes the square. We just need to factor this, right? And that factors into x minus 7 over 2 times x minus 7 over 2. Really, that's always just this number divided by 2, right? And then over here, nothing happened. It just stayed the same. Again, now we're just going to, this is why it's completing the square, because when we factor this, we end up with 2 of the same factors, and we're just going to express that as a square. This times this is just this thing squared. Okay. Now we have to move all the stuff that's over here by the g of x over to the other side. If there was a fraction over here, we would subtract that first, right? And then multiply by 4. But here there's just a 4, so we're just going to move that original a back over to the right side by multiplying by 4. Multiplication, because this is division, and multiplication undoes division. So 4 divided by 4 is just 1, so I just find out with g of x, and then this 4 just sits over here on the right, on the right side, and we've completed the square. So when I plug it in to, this is kind of tricky. You notice our solution, it's minus 7 over 2, right? We have a plus here. But the way we're going to get around that is just do minus 7 over 2. Okay, so 4x plus negative 7 over 2, which is really the same as x minus 7 over 2. And then over here, we didn't have this constant. And that really was because when we added this number to both sides, it canceled that fraction out. But if there was a fraction, you would wind up with something over here. If there's not anything over there, you can just put 0 here. So I hope that helped a little bit. This is a tricky skill. If you have more questions, just let me know.